If you've been around Backstage for any length of time, you've probably seen this introduction to Backstage at Spotify YouTube video, which was created back in May 8th of 2020. This was released at a time when Backstage open source was just getting off the ground, the project was still fairly new, and it's an introduction to how Backstage is used inside Spotify. Now, the Spotify version of Backstage, which runs internally, is a little bit different than the open source version of Backstage. So I thought it would be interesting to take a look at the open source version of Backstage as we stand in April of 2022, almost 2 years after this original video was released. So over here, I have an instance of Backstage that I use for doing demos at Roadie. This is the main catalog view of this Backstage instance, and you can see it lists services just like you would expect. One of the primary functions of Backstage is to act as a software catalog, and so that's what you're seeing here. Now, the open source version of Backstage doesn't just track software components, it also tracks lots of different types of entity. So you can see here, it's tracking users, resources, which might represent S3 buckets, groups, which are teams of users, APIs, etc. And you can get this type of catalog view for every different type of entity in your company. Now, ownership is a core concept of Backstage, and you'll see that I've filtered the list here to the 38 components that I own. Now, Backstage knows that I own these components because they each have an owner associated with them. In some cases, it's the engineering team, and Backstage knows that I'm on the engineering team. Now, I can click in here, and this is the place where I will get a sense of the engineering team and start to understand what they own and who they are. You can see that the engineering team is linked in a hierarchy alongside some other teams here. I can see who the members are. I can see the different types of services and other types of components that they own. And I can even use the tabs across the top to put some documentation about this team in place. So maybe this is where we will talk about our sprint ceremonies or the ways that we work together. So this is the kind of homepage for this engineering team inside Backstage. Now, just going back to the catalog for a second, I can click into one of the software components here, and this is where we will go to get an overview of what this software component is and maybe understand what it's used for and how we could contribute to it. This is the overview page. You'll see I have lots of different widgets. Each of these is a component pulled in from a plugin. So for example here, the PagerDuty Backstage plugin is providing this information from PagerDuty. I can see who's on call, and if there were any active incidents, I'd be able to get some information on them here. I also have builds pulled in from GitHub Actions in this case, but many different CI tools are supported. I have some links out to third-party services like a Datadog dashboard. And if there was an operational issue with this service at this time, I could go here, quickly find this service, and then find a link to the dashboards that I need in the heat of the moment. Backstage can also help with compliance and security checks. So you'll see I have a little compliance widget here, which tells me whether or not protected branches are enabled. I have some GitHub pull request statistics that give me a sense of whether or not this service is actively maintained. I have a README pulled in from GitHub, and I have a relations map here, which shows me how this service relates to the other components that exist inside my company. I also have some tabs across the top here, and these are places to go and get a deeper view. So for example, I have a dedicated security dashboard with dependabot alerts and sneak vulnerabilities on it. I have another look into CI. I can click in here and maybe re-trigger a certain build if it has failed. I can get a sense of why my build might have failed. And again, the idea is not to replace the entire UI of your CI tool here, but just pull together the information which is most important to engineers who are trying to get their daily work done. Now, this service one provides an API, and I can click in here and I can see the definition of it. This is a standard open API specification, and I can use this to get a sense of what endpoints are available for this particular service. So you can see how engineers can use this to firstly answer questions like, well, do we have a service which does a particular task? And then hopefully when they can go into Backstage, find that service, and then they can immediately go to the API and start to get a sense for how they might use it. Now, just going back to the particular service that we were talking about, once you know that a service exists, the next question typically is like, okay, well, how do I get started with it, right? How do I authenticate, etc. And so TechDocs is the place that you would go to answer those questions. This is somewhere that you can put your technical documentation. People can easily find it. It's searchable inside Backstage, and it's also written as Markdown, which engineers typically like to write. Now, the way this works is that you'll write Markdown files and store them alongside your code in the GitHub repository or other type of repository that the code exists in, and they will go through the same pull request workflow as your code changes do. This is nice because they're markdown files and they're easy to write, but also they go through the same peer review process as your code does, and so it's easy to remember to keep them up to date or to catch problems with the documentation. Now, once the markdown files are written, they go through a CI pipeline, and they're built into HTML and stored and then rendered inside Backstage. And this is nice because they're all co-located and organized and categorized by service, which makes them easy to find. If these were in Confluence, they could be anywhere. Different teams would have different structures. There wouldn't be a really good way to find what I'm looking for when it comes to technical documentation about a particular service. All of the standard markdown functions are supported here. So you'll see tables and images and code blocks, etc. I can also have even mermaid diagrams, which were recently announced as being supported on GitHub. A few more things here. I have pull requests pulled in from GitHub for this service. I have the Kubernetes plugin. This is the official Spotify Backstage Kubernetes plugin installed here. And you can see I have it connected up to two different clusters, Dev0 and Nick Test. One of these is in Google's cloud platform and the other one is in AWS. So if you're running a multi-cloud, this can be an interesting way to get visibility into multiple different clusters. This list could be as long. You can imagine that this would be, maybe one of these is a staging cluster and one is a production cluster. And I can use this to answer questions like how many pods have we got running in production or in a particular region, are any of them not healthy at the moment, etc. Right? So this is a way to give dev teams some visibility into how their services are deployed in production. It's not going to expose the entire infrastructure of a production setup or Kubernetes cluster to people who are in Backstage, but just the key information that the dev teams need to do their jobs. Now that we've seen how software looks inside Backstage, let's try and understand how this all works. Each component in Backstage is typically represented by a YAML metadata structure. If I go to GitHub and I look at the repository for the sample service, which is what we've just been looking at inside Backstage, you'll see that I have this catalog info YAML file, and in here I have some metadata which describes my service and explains how it's going to look inside Backstage. So I have a name and a title, which is a human representation of the name of the service, a description, some links out to Datadog. I showed that in the video a little bit earlier on. The owner is indicated here. And this is where we're explaining that this service provides an API called the sample service API that will link this up with the open API specification that we saw earlier on. It also has some annotations, and annotations are the things which describe the mapping between a particular third-party service, PagerDuty maybe, for example, in this case, and Backstage. So Backstage will use this PagerDuty integration key to understand that service X in PagerDuty corresponds with the sample service inside Backstage. That's how it sets up a mapping, and that's how most of the plugins work. So as long as you have some YAML just like this for each service that you want to represent inside Backstage, you can ingest everything and it should all work. The other way to get things into Backstage is to use the scaffolder to create them. Now, the scaffolder is a feature of Backstage which is useful for creating new services or new types of software. Typically, what will happen is an engineer inside your company will come to the scaffolder. They will choose a predefined template which should have the best practices of your organization already encoded into it. Templates will usually do a number of things in a series of steps. They will take a predefined code base from a well-known location. This will be a code base which is already being kind of blessed by the people inside your organization as ready for production. It will pass some values into it which the user provides. If I choose this template here for a GitHub Pages website, you'll see it's asking me now what the name of my website should be. This value will then be passed into that code base that I mentioned earlier on, and it will be used to create a new repo, put the code base into it, and then it will run some kind of arbitrary steps to hook it up to the different tools that we use. So for example, it might send a request to Circle CI so that my GitHub Pages website is already hooked up to the CI tool, and the builds are already running just because I have created a brand new service. And so the idea is this, that by baking the best practices of your organization into these templates and then making them really easy for people to use inside your organization, the path of least resistance for creating a new service also has the best practices built in. If people use this, then you can see how it leads to kind of greater operational maturity, better production homogeneity, and an overall healthier production environment. We don't have kind of bespoke snowflake services as much as we would have had before. People still get to create new services, and they actually can do it more easily than they could before. And so, but the engineering teams are happy, operations people are happy, and overall we have a more mature environment. That's the Backstage scaffolder. Last things I want to touch on are the tech radar. So Backstage has this concept of a kind of global plugins, which are not tied to any particular service. They typically exist in the sidebar like this. And this is a good place to put information about your organization, things that you want to share widely and have people reference quite frequently. So in this case, a tech radar will help people to make technology choices inside your organization. The last thing I wanted to show you is the Backstage Home plugin. If I click Home in the sidebar here, we'll go to it. Now, all of the information I've showed you so far, the catalog, the tech radar, etc., these show information which is displayed on a kind of per service level. You go to a service and you can see some information about it. But the other key component of Backstage is the users who actually use it and log into it every day. The Home plugin is a place to pull distributed information together and present it on a kind of per user view. Hopefully putting the most important information that you need to do every day front and center when you log into Backstage. This is my homepage, and you can see here I have some different widgets that I've kind of configured together to give me the information that I need. So I have the components that I own, and I can get quick access to some of those. I have my calendar pulled in here from Google Calendar, and I can go to a Zoom meeting whenever one is coming up. I also still like to do a little bit of coding in my spare time, and so I have review requests represented here so that I can see if somebody's waiting on a review for me. I have my open pull requests so that I can nudge somebody if I need to. And then I have, and I'm not using it properly yet, but I have this markdown widget which allows me to render markdown content on the homepage here. And this, most of our customers are using this as a way to kind of push organizational news to people's Backstage homepages and keep them up to date. And of course I have search. So putting things into Backstage is great, but you need to be able to find them. And so search is front and center on the homepage so that you can search for components, you can search for technical documentation, etc. You can see how this brings all of the information that you need to create, manage, and explore inside your organization front and center and makes it easy to find.